So a physician, an economist, and an engineer were discussing which of their professions came first. And the doctor said, well, Eve was taken from the rib of Adam, obviously a medical procedure. And the engineer said, yeah, but you couldn't have done any of that without medical equipment that an engineer designed. So the engineer came first. The economist said, you folks just don't get it, do you? It says in the very first sentence of the first chapter of Genesis that this was all created from a formless void. And nobody's better at making something out of a formless void than an economist. So you get to see today if I accomplished that. The reason I blamed Deb is because she's been after me about talking about an income tax and all that sort of stuff. And my original intent was to talk about the tax system generally, and I do have some strong feelings about our tax system. But as I started working on it, I realized that the property tax has become very important and a hot issue. According to the Wall Street Journal a few months ago, there were, in the last election in November of 24, 10 statewide ballot measures, including South Dakota, North Dakota, and I think the other one was Wyoming. Not South Dakota. North Dakota, I think Wyoming, and Montana. 8 of those passed. North Dakota's would have essentially eliminated the property tax. It failed, but it got 30-some% of the vote. So it's a pretty hot issue. In South Dakota, in the last legislative session, there were, by my count, 10 bills introduced that would have provided tax reform. None of those, of course, passed. Instead, we got the interim study, which in the last week or so came out with 19 proposals. I have not read them all. I'm sure I've seen them all before. So what I'm going to try to do today is talk about the property tax. It's really the residential property tax, what we call the owner-occupied property in South Dakota. That's most important, or that's the big issue right now. And so I'm going to try to talk about that. We all know that property values, housing values, have gone up pretty substantially in the last 10 years or so, which is what I've got here. What this is data provided by Zillow. There are a number of different ways you can, different series of data provided. I used this one because I figured it would be probably familiar to most people. The big increase that we saw was from about the middle of 2020 or 2021 up to sometime in 2023. And then property values have leveled off in the last few weeks, or in the last few years. Most of the data that I have ends in 2023 because there's always a lag between the collection of the data and when it becomes available. This is just another graph that I found that shows how if we adjust for inflation, property values have still risen so they've risen much faster than inflation. As it turns out, and I'll have a graph here later that shows that, the increase in property values has been about equal to the increase in people's incomes, household income. Now, I may or may not get finished here, so I'm going to give you a little bit of advance notice of where I'm going. This also tends to get confusing, so maybe if you know where I'm going. I'm going to try to show that we really don't need property tax reform in South Dakota, that our taxes are not that far out of line compared to other places or compared to, let's say, 10 years ago. And as I was putting this together, the Atlantic had a cartoon that seemed to me appropriate here. Some guys sitting in a bar, one says to another, "Are you just and moaning, or can you verify what you're saying with data?" So I'm going to try to verify what I'm saying with data. Let's start with some definitions so that we're sort of all on the same page, and also I think that's important because at least it reminds us generally of how the property tax system works. So we'll start with the market value, which is sort of the ideal, or sometimes called the true value or the actual value. What a house would sell for, or does sell for, in an arm's length transaction between willing buyers and sellers. So in other words, what we want is a sale that's a true market sale, not something, say, that's a sale between parents and children or something like that. The assessed value is the value that the assessor, or in South Dakota we call him the Director of Equalization, assigns between sales values. So for example, our house, we built our house in 1990, so it's 35 years old. We know what we paid for it then, we know what we think the market value was then, but it's gone up quite a bit since then. And in order to figure out the property value, we need to have some idea of, well, what would that house sell for today? And that's the assessor's job. Now, typically, and this is not really a criticism of the assessors, they tend to underassess property. The state estimates the degree of underassessment by looking every year at property that has in fact sold in an arm's length transaction and compares the assessed value on the assessor's books at the time of that sale divided by the amount of the sale. And then they put all that information together and provide what we call the assessment sales ratio. In South Dakota, the sort of guideline is that property is supposed to be assessed, or it's hard to know what to call it here, that the assessed value is supposed to be 85% of market value. It jumps all over. That's actually a real improvement from, I wrote a paper years ago with a graph that showed the assessment sales ratios over the years. Sometimes they were 50%, sometimes they were less than that. So that's an improvement. I'm pushing the wrong button here. Ideally, assessed value is equal to market value. Or in other words, assessment sales ratio is equal to 1. So we've got we've talked about the tax base now. The mill rate is the rate that the local government officials settle on that is applied to the assessed value to give you tax collections. So tax collections are equal to assessed value times the mill rate. What we're really interested in here is the effective tax rate, which is tax collections divided by the market value. And that's what I'm going to talk about here first. How do we estimate the effective tax rate? Now let me review again. The effective tax rate is not the mill rate, the rate that you actually see, but it's the amount of tax collected divided by the actual value of the property in that particular year. The two ways I'm going to look at here to study the effective tax rate. One is the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is conducted every year by the Census Bureau. It's a highly regarded survey. It's done every year. It's a large enough national survey that we even get a big enough sample in South Dakota that we can have meaningful data out of that. The questions that they include are the value of their homeowner's residence and the property tax they paid. And then I'm also going to use some state data after I've looked at the American Community Survey. And the American Community Survey data is actually on tax collections and housing value is generated by the Tax Foundation using the American Community Survey. And I found that when I started working on this, and I've used ACS data before, both microdata and a lot of other data, and it's a highly reputable, highly regarded. A lot of academics use it for their research. And then I'm also going to use state data, which the state provides, and what they do is they put out an annual report in which they present the effective tax rate using not a survey, but the actual tax collections in certain places. And as I put here, tax collections divided by the assessed value divided by the assessment sales ratio. Assessed value divided by the assessment sales ratio is their best estimate of the actual value of the property. So this is where I'm beginning with the Tax Foundation data. It shows that South Dakota's effective tax rate is 1.09%, and we rank 19th in the effective tax rate. Now, some of this data is beginning to be updated. I think the next value of the next set of ACS data is coming out. I think that this is going to show that it's 18th now, but that's close enough. And then I just threw this in because I had it, and because it's helps to explain why our tax burden is the way it is. We're one of the states that doesn't tax personal property. And some of you, some of us here are old enough, back, as Mark Shields would say, shortly after the earth cooled, that that was eliminated. I think that actually happened before I came here, so you know it was some time ago. The state eliminated the personal property tax. That was the one where I'm told, I never had to do one, where you filled out a form that told what the value of your furniture. And Lauren Carlson used to tell the story that in Clay County one year there was one diamond ring. Hence it was called the liar's tax. Hence they decided to eliminate it. This is just another way of looking at the same thing. Our 1.09% It shows that our effective tax rate is quite a bit below Nebraska and Iowa. We'll see that all the way through. About equal to Minnesota and North Dakota, and well above Montana and Wyoming. And I think everybody knows that part of the reason Montana and Wyoming have such low rates is because they have severance taxes, which provide a lot of state aid to the local governments. Okay, here's where we really get into it here. This is property values according to the American Community Survey for about 10 years. I tried to make this a little easier to understand by putting all the South Dakota lines are black lines with bubbles, and the 3 states that I think are of most interest to us, Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska, are primary colors, blue, red, and yellow, and the other 3 are the states way out there. So what I showed you there was property values, the median value of houses, of owner-occupied houses in South Dakota, in each of those states. Here's property taxes. I wanted to mention. Clearly, property values have been increasing, and then they accelerated beginning about 2021, which is consistent with that graph that I showed you before, that shows that the property values increased pretty substantially from 21 to 23. I don't have anything past 23 for this one. Property taxes also went up. Not surprisingly, most people would think that, well, since the tax rate must stay the same, as house values go up, assessments go up, and taxes go up. So now let's take the property taxes and divide by the property values to get the effective tax rate. That, I think, will surprise a lot of people. The effective tax rate went down beginning in about 2021. In some of the states stayed fairly constant, but it dropped pretty substantially in South Dakota. How's that happen? Well, because of limits on what the local governments can do, they either have to lower their mill rate, not have assessments keep up with housing, with the value of the house, or something else happens. So to look at that, here's median household income, and as I said before, if I take taxes divided by housing value, that's what I showed you back here. Taxes divided by the value of the houses. If I take taxes divided by median household income, I get fairly constant tax burdens. When we look at the property tax, at the effective tax rate, taxes as a percent of housing value, that's one measure of the ability to pay, but ability to pay isn't measured very well for a lot of people by the value of their house. Okay? Our ability to pay taxes as measured by the housing value went up substantially since we built our house. Maybe our income didn't go, I'll assure you that our income did not go up that much. So maybe household income is a better measure of ability to pay. And that's just what I'm trying to show here. So that relative to ability to pay in South Dakota and in some of these other states did not go up all that much. This is just another way of showing the same thing. This shows that some things never change. Now, to understand why the effective tax rate went down, I think we need to look at the history of property limitations in South Dakota. Before 1989, the only restriction on local property taxes was a restriction on mill rates. By statute, the mill rate was set, but as I said, at that time, assessed values were way below actual values. So if you wanted to get around the limits, the mill rate limits, all you had to do is raise the assessment from one year to another. And you could, and they were set, there were different mill rates for municipalities, school districts, counties, and townships. Okay. Then in 1980 and 1988, again shortly after the earth cooled, we had Dakota Proposition 1 and Dakota Proposition 2. They would have severely limited property taxes, and they both failed. In 1990, the state legislature wanted to get into the picture because property tax rates were going up pretty substantially, and so they proposed a constitutional amendment to limit revenue increases to 2% per year, and that one failed. In 90 and 91, we had a property tax freeze, again, an attempt to stop taxes from going up. A few local governments opted out. They removed the freeze and property taxes jumped substantially. In 94, another initiated measure, something like Dakota Proposition, limited taxes to 1% of assessed value. Now, the effective rate was about, we saw up there before, was a little over 1%. If it was 1% of assessed value, which was maybe 50% of market value, that would have substantially cut property tax rates, and then would have limited assessment increases to 1.25%, which is in no way keeps up with inflation. Well, that one failed too, but it got 49.4% positive votes. That got people's attention. And we ended up with a property tax reduction program, which is pretty much what's in place today. It locked in revenue levels. So if your city was already collecting more taxes, say per capita, than another city, that relative burden stayed the same. So they were frozen at whatever the current rates were. Local revenues were limited to inflation, or what's called the index factor, or 3%, whichever is less. So if property values went up, or cost of government services or whatever went up more than 3%, we couldn't keep up. If it went up less than 3%, you could only raise it by that amount. They were also allowed to, if let's say you made some improvements to your house, they could raise the assessment accordingly, even if that's more than the index factor. Allowed opt-outs, we're all familiar with opt-outs now, and changed the school aid formula. Before 95, there were two classifications of property, land and agricultural and non-agricultural. With this, they divided the non-agricultural into commercial, other it's called, into owner-occupied property and other, which is essentially commercial and industrial. Okay, now I'm going to go to looking at the data that comes from the state. What I've showed you so far has been essentially the data that comes from the American Community Survey. This is what the state provides based on the data that the Director of Equalization collects. So here, and I could only find data beginning in 2018 online, and I didn't feel like going to the library. So here's what's happened in the last 6 years or so to ag. Is that the market value is low. This is the residential property, or owner-occupied, we call it in South Dakota, and then the other, which is business property. So basically what it tells us is that the tax rate, the property tax rate on business property is considerably higher than the property tax rate on housing. Now, I put these two graphs together, and I know it looks kind of confusing, but I was just amazed when I found this. This is the one that I showed you already using the American Community Survey. This is the graph that I just showed you based on state data. Completely different sources. I mean, totally different sources. And yet, look how much they agree. They're very close to the same. Now, this is the latest data is payable in 24. The latest from the state, the latest from the American Community Survey is 23. That makes them look a little bit different, but if you think about the source of those two, the American Community Survey sends out a survey, asks people how much their property is worth, their house is worth, how much their property tax is, and then we calculate that. Let's say they do that in 23. What that really is the value of the property in 23 for taxes payable in 24. So I think these really should be, this should be lagged behind that by 1 year. That makes these, and as somebody who has worked with a lot of economic data for 50 years, almost, I can tell you that kind of agreement from two different sources is really pretty amazing. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So let's go back. This was statewide effective property tax rates. And then I broke them out for the three largest cities in the state and a couple others that I thought might be of interest to us. So this is statewide. That's what I've already just showed you. What this shows is that Vermillion's owner-occupied property tax rate is above the state average and above most of the other states that, the other governments that, local taxes that I've shown here. Here's business and industrial. You can't really see the bubbles in there, but
Ray, just for clarity, commercial also includes rental property, right?
yes.
Okay.
Yep. And then this is ag land, but you've got to take that with a grain of salt, because what they say in the report that presents this is that what they've done for ag land for each of those cities is it only includes the township in which the city is located. Well, one, that's not going to be a very big sample. Two, you're talking about areas where probably the price has been bid up around the larger cities, but not around the smaller ones. There's also, they've changed the way that they assess ag land the last few years, and I have not kept up with that. Okay, I put that in there. I want to look at one more thing, and then I'll get back to that. What I haven't talked about much is the distribution of the tax burden. What happens? How does the distribution of the tax burden vary by income? Do low-income people pay a higher percentage of their income, or do higher-income people pay a higher or lower percentage of their income? I can't find much data that presents that in the usual way of putting incomes down here and tax rates up here. Usually, in looking at property tax at housing values, the standard is that housing, the cost of housing should not exceed 30% of income. If it exceeds 30% of income, it's referred to as cost burdened. And so, and I've only found a couple graphs. This one shows by income levels, one, that cost burdens have been going up. It's the percentage of houses, the percentage of households that had cost burdens greater than 30%. So you can see that low-income people are much more likely to have a cost burden than higher-income people. And then here I have the data for the South Dakota and the surrounding states. Shows that renters face much higher cost burdens, including in South Dakota, although I think it's worth noting that homeowners are a little bit above the national, no, I guess they're below the national average, but only slightly. And then this showed up on my computer a couple days ago, and so I thought I'd just put it in. This finds that the average rent in South Dakota in 24 was $999. And I did the calculation of the cost burden. If your income is below about $40,000, that would be, if your income is about $40,000, that would be the rent that is on the border of being cost burdened. And so if your income is below that, you're facing a cost burden if you're paying the median cost. Now, let me go back to my summary and conclusions, and I'm just about out of time. The current residential property tax is less than it was 10 years ago relative to home values. That's the effective tax rate. About the same as it was 10 years ago relative to household income. So even though house values have gone up, even though property taxes have gone up, so have incomes, at least median incomes for South Dakotans. It's below Nebraska and Iowa. I didn't have time to really point to Iowa or Nebraska. Nebraska typically pays very high property taxes, and Iowa is also fairly high. Equal or slightly above Minnesota, above Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming by most measures, and that's, again, a lot of that is because of severance taxes indirectly. Proposed reforms: increase the tax burden on lower income households. The Institute for Tax and Expenditure Policy does a study every few years of the distribution of state and local tax burdens, and they rank South Dakota about 6th in the nation in terms of a regressive tax structure, in terms of putting too much burden or putting a great deal of burden on low-income people. And now I'm getting to the hobby horse that I've ridden for several years, and some of you have heard this before. I've done a study, and Ernst & Young has done a study, both of which find that about 40% of South Dakota's sales tax, 40% of the sales tax is on business inputs. What this would do, what's shifting in most, and a lot of the proposals that are out there are for reducing the property tax and shifting it on to sales tax. If 40% of the sales tax is on business, what this is going to do is increase the tax burden on business investment and make South Dakota a less desirable place for investing in business. And I'll stop with that. Thank you. I guess we don't have time for questions.
Well, maybe one, but. Yeah, maybe just talk to her. Thank you.
Okay.
Good time management, too. All right, have our 50-50 drawing. Betty, would you like to? Patrick Morrison. He's not here? Okay. All right, and Jim, would you like to, he's already ready to lead us in song.
Yeah, I've heard two different pitches. We'll try that one. My country is a big sweet land of today.